The silver buckle on Sheriff Wade's belt caught the morning sun as he dragged Matilda Keating by her arm through the dusty main street of Columbus, New Mexico. It was 1878, and the spectacle drew every pair of eyes in the small border town. "I didn't steal anything," Matilda protested, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the growing crowd. Her honey-brown hair had come loose from its pins, and her blue calico dress was smudged with dirt where she'd been thrown to the ground during her arrest at the general store. "Save your lies for the judge, Miss Keating," Sheriff Wade sneered, his grip tightening around her wrist as he pulled her toward the jailhouse. "We've got witnesses who saw you pocket Mrs. Thornton's silver brooch." Tears of frustration welled in Matilda's eyes. At 24, she'd come to Columbus just 3 months prior, seeking a fresh start after her parents' deaths left her alone in the world. She'd found work as a seamstress at Mrs. Everett's dress shop, kept to herself, and never caused any trouble until now. "Please," she begged, "search me. I have nothing that isn't mine." Sheriff Wade ignored her pleas as he shoved her through the jailhouse door. The room smelled of stale tobacco and sweat. He pushed her toward a cell in the back, the iron bars casting long shadows across the wooden floor. "You can tell your story to Judge Parker when he comes through next week," the sheriff said, locking the cell door with a decisive click that echoed through the small building. "Until then, you can think about what happens to thieves in Columbus." Matilda collapsed onto the thin mattress, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She knew what the sheriff meant. Judge Parker was known throughout the territory for his harsh sentencing, especially for women who didn't have family connections or money for a proper defense. Outside the jailhouse window, the sound of approaching hoofbeats pulled her attention. A tall figure on horseback had stopped in front of the building, dismounting with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. Garrett James had just ridden into town, unaware of the drama unfolding at the jailhouse. He'd been working as a ranch hand at the Whitaker place, 10 miles outside Columbus for the past year, and his tall frame, broad shoulders, and quiet demeanor had earned him both respect and a healthy dose of wariness from the townspeople. As he tied his horse to the hitching post, he noticed the crowd dispersing from in front of the jailhouse, whispering among themselves. Catching snippets of conversation about that new seamstress and theft, Garrett felt a twinge of curiosity. He'd crossed paths with the seamstress a few times at the general store, and while they'd never spoken more than simple pleasantries, something about her dignified manner had caught his attention. Dusting off his worn leather vest, Garrett pushed open the jailhouse door. Sheriff Wade was seated at his desk, feet propped up, cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife. "James," Wade acknowledged without looking up, "if you're here about those cattle rustlers, I still ain't got any leads." "Actually, I'm here to post the tax on Mr. Whitaker's new land purchase," Garrett replied, placing an envelope on the desk. His eyes drifted to the back of the room where he caught sight of Matilda sitting in the cell, her face tear-streaked but composed. "What's she in for?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. The sheriff snorted. "Caught her stealing a silver brooch from old Lady Thornton, right in the middle of the general store, bold as brass." Matilda's head shot up. "I did not steal anything, Mrs. Thornton dropped her brooch and I was picking it up to return it when the sheriff arrived." Sheriff Wade laughed. "That's what they all say. But Mrs. Thornton's maid saw you pocket something shiny, and when I searched the store, the brooch was nowhere to be found. Pretty damning, if you ask me." Garrett's eyes narrowed slightly. Something about the sheriff's story didn't sit right with him. He'd heard rumors about Wade whispers of missing evidence, selective justice, and bribes, but had never paid them much mind. "Has anyone searched her room at the boarding house?" Garrett asked. Planning to head there after my lunch, Wade replied, patting his stomach. Got to keep up my strength for law enforcement. Garrett nodded, his mind already working. When's the judge due? Next week. Parker's making his rounds. Matilda's face paled at the mention of the judge, and Garrett noticed. Judge Parker was notorious for making examples of people, especially newcomers to the territory with no connections. I'll be seeing you, Sheriff, Garrett said, tipping his hat. Before leaving, he caught Matilda's eye. Don't worry, madam. The truth has a way of coming to light. Outside, Garrett didn't head to the saloon as he'd planned. Instead, he walked toward Mrs. Everett's dress shop where Matilda worked. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, and Mrs. Everett looked up from her sewing, surprise evident on her face at seeing a ranch hand in her establishment. Mr. James, isn't it? She asked, setting aside her work. What can I do for you? Need a shirt mended? No, madam, Garrett replied, removing his hat. I wanted to ask about Miss Keating. I understand she works for you. Mrs. Everett's expression darkened. Worked. I can't have a thief in my shop, no matter how skilled with a needle she might be. You're certain she's guilty, then? Garrett asked quietly. The older woman hesitated. Well, Sheriff Wade seemed quite sure, and Mrs. Thornton is one of my best customers. Has Miss Keating ever given you reason to doubt her honesty before today? Mrs. Everett sighed, her fingers absently tracing the pattern on a piece of fabric. No. In fact, she's been nothing but hardworking and honest. Last month she found a gold dollar in the fitting room and turned it in immediately, said it must have fallen from a customer's purse. Garrett nodded. Doesn't sound like the behavior of a thief. No, Mrs. Everett admitted. It doesn't. But what can I do? Wade's the law in Columbus. Could I see where Miss Keating worked? Her sewing table or such? Mrs. Everett led him to the back of the shop where a small workspace was arranged near a window that offered good light. A half-finished dress was draped over a dressmaker's form, pins carefully placed along the seam. She was working on this when Wade came for her, Mrs. Everett explained. It's for the banker's daughter's wedding. Garrett examined the fine stitching, the careful attention to detail. Everything about Matilda's workspace was meticulously organized, threads arranged by color, scissors and pins in their proper places, not the work area of someone impulsive or dishonest. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Everett, Garrett said, replacing his hat. I appreciate your candor. As he left the shop, Garrett's suspicions deepened. His next stop was the Thornton residence, a grand home on the edge of town that showcased the family's wealth from their silver mining interests. The maid who answered the door eyed him warily. Mr. Thornton isn't receiving visitors today. I'm not here to see Mr. Thornton, Garrett explained. I understand you were at the general store when Miss Keating allegedly stole Mrs. Thornton's brooch. The young woman glanced over her shoulder nervously. I should get back to my duties. It would only take a moment, Garrett pressed. What exactly did you see? The maid's eyes darted around again before she spoke in a hushed voice. I didn't actually see her pocket anything. I told Mrs. Thornton that Miss Keating was bending down near where she'd been standing, and that's when Mrs. Thornton realized her brooch was missing. So you didn't witness a theft? No, sir, she admitted. But Sheriff Wade said, I know what the sheriff said, Garrett interrupted gently. Thank you for your honesty. By the time Garrett returned to town, afternoon was giving way to evening. The jailhouse was dark. Sheriff Wade had likely moved to the saloon for his evening whiskey, leaving Matilda alone with no supper and no company save for the mice that occasionally scurried along the baseboards. Garrett tied his horse behind the building and approached the rear window of the jail. The iron bars were firmly in place, but the window itself was slightly ajar to allow air into the stuffy cell. Miss Keating, he called softly. Matilda appeared at the window, her face showing surprise and wariness. "Mr. James, what are you doing here?" "I believe you're innocent," he said without preamble, "and I aim to prove it." Relief flooded her features, followed quickly by doubt. "Why would you help me? You hardly know me." Garrett's expression remained steady. "I've learned to recognize honesty when I see it. And I've been watching Sheriff Wade for some time. Things don't add up." Matilda gripped the bars. "He didn't even let me speak at the general store, just grabbed me and announced I was under arrest. When I protested, he twisted my arm behind my back and pushed me toward the door." "Tell me exactly what happened before that." "I was buying thread for Mrs. Everett. Mrs. Thornton was also there, ordering supplies to be delivered to her house. I noticed something sparkle on the floor near where she'd been standing. When I bent to pick it up, I saw it was a silver brooch with a blue stone turquoise, I think. Before I could call out to her, the sheriff burst in and accused me of stealing it." Garrett nodded slowly. "Did you actually touch the brooch?" "No," Matilda said. "I was reaching for it when Sheriff Wade grabbed me. So the brooch should still have been on the floor of the general store." "Exactly. But when Mr. Peterson, the store owner, looked where I was pointing, there was nothing there." Garrett's jaw tightened. "Someone must have picked it up in the confusion. Or it was never there to begin with," Matilda suggested. "Perhaps Mrs. Thornton lost her brooch elsewhere and assumed it was at the store." "Perhaps," Garrett agreed, though his mind was working on a different theory. "I'll be back tomorrow. Try to rest." As he turned to leave, Matilda called after him softly. "Mr. James, thank you for believing me." Garrett tipped his hat, his face partially hidden in the gathering dusk. "Get some sleep, Miss Keating. Things will look different tomorrow." The next morning, Garrett waited until Sheriff Wade left the jailhouse to get his breakfast at the hotel dining room before making his move. The deputy, a young man named Charlie who was more interested in impressing girls than upholding the law, was easily convinced to take an extended coffee break when Garrett mentioned that the new barmaid at the saloon had been asking about him. Once alone, Garrett began a systematic search of the sheriff's office. If Wade had taken the brooch himself, it had to be somewhere in the building. He checked the desk drawers, the gun cabinet, and even lifted the corner of the worn rug, finding nothing but dust and a few forgotten bullets. As he was about to give up, his eye caught on the small safe tucked in the corner behind the sheriff's desk. It was an older model, the kind that had been popular before the war. Garrett had seen one like it before, when he'd worked for a banker in Kansas City, who taught him the weakness of the mechanism. Kneeling before the safe, Garrett pressed his ear against the cool metal and began to slowly turn the dial, listening for the telltale click of the tumblers falling into place. It took nearly 20 minutes of patient work before the safe door swung open with a creak that seemed deafening in the empty office. Inside, Garrett found several small cloth bags that clinked with the sound of coins, a bundle of papers, and a small wooden box. Opening the box, he felt a surge of triumph. There, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a silver brooch with a turquoise stone exactly as Matilda had described. But it wasn't the only piece of jewelry in the box. There was a gold locket, a pair of pearl earrings, and several rings, items that had likely been evidence in other cases that had mysteriously disappeared from the sheriff's custody. Garrett was so engrossed in his discovery that he almost missed the sound of boots on the wooden boardwalk outside. Hastily replacing everything except the brooch, which he slipped into his vest pocket, he closed the safe and moved to sit in one of the visitors' chairs just as the door swung open. Sheriff Wade stopped short at the sight of Garrett, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holstered pistol. "What are you doing in my office, James?" Garrett leaned back in the chair, affecting a casual pose. "Waiting for you, Sheriff. Thought you might want to know that the Whitaker Ranch lost 2 calves to wolves last night. Mr. Whitaker wanted me to report it in case other ranches are having similar troubles. Wade relaxed slightly, moving to sit behind his desk. Wolves, huh? Been more of them than usual this year. From her cell, Matilda watched the exchange with wide eyes, having witnessed Garrett's search of the safe. She remained silent, understanding instinctively that he was playing a dangerous game. Might be a good idea to organize a hunting party, Garrett suggested, rising from his chair. Before they get bold enough to come closer to town. I'll think on it, Wade replied, clearly uninterested. His gaze shifted to Matilda. Your breakfast is on the desk there. Don't say I'm not a generous keeper. The meager meal consisted of a hard biscuit and a cup of cold coffee. Matilda nodded wordlessly, her eyes meeting Garrett's briefly as he turned to leave. Oh, one more thing, Sheriff, Garrett said at the door. I was talking to Mrs. Thornton's maid yesterday. Interesting that she never actually saw Miss Keating steal anything. Wade's expression darkened. You questioning how I do my job, Cowboy, Garrett shrugged, just making conversation. Good day to you, Sheriff. Miss Keating. Outside, Garrett mounted his horse and rode not toward the Whitaker Ranch but to the home of Judge William Parker, who had arrived in Columbus ahead of schedule and was staying with the town's doctor, an old friend of his. Judge Parker was a stern man with a reputation for fairness beneath his harsh sentencing. He received Garrett in the doctor's study, listening without interruption as the cowboy explained his suspicions and produced the brooch as evidence. This is a serious accusation against a lawman, Parker said when Garrett had finished. You have any proof beyond this brooch that Sheriff Wade has been systematically stealing from the townspeople and framing innocents? The safe contains other jewelry items, Garrett replied. And I believe if you questioned the owners of those pieces, they'd confirm they were supposedly lost or stolen cases that Wade claimed were never solved. Parker stroked his gray beard thoughtfully. I've had concerns about Wade for some time. Reports from other judges in the circuit. Nothing concrete, but enough to warrant investigation. He stood, reaching for his coat. I'll need you to show me this safe and its contents, Mr. James. Together, they rode back to the jailhouse where they found Deputy Charlie had returned from his extended break and was sitting with his boots propped on the desk, reading a dime novel. Judge Parker. Charlie scrambled to his feet, nearly knocking over his chair. We weren't expecting you until next week. Clearly, Parker replied dryly. Where is Sheriff Wade? He went to search Miss Keating's room at the boarding house, sir. Said he needed to find more evidence for her trial. Garrett tensed. Wade might be planting false evidence at this very moment. Judge Parker, I think we should. I agree, Parker interrupted, understanding Garrett's concern. Deputy, you will open that safe for me immediately. Mr. James, go to the boarding house and ensure Sheriff Wade conducts his search properly. I'll handle matters here. Garrett didn't need to be told twice. He raced his horse through town, drawing stares from pedestrians as he thundered past. The boarding house was at the far end of the main street, a respectable establishment run by a widow named Mrs. Fletcher, who prided herself on maintaining a proper home. He arrived to find Wade's horse hitched outside. Taking the porch steps 2 at a time, Garrett burst through the front door to find Mrs. Fletcher wringing her hands in the entryway. He wouldn't wait for me to accompany him, she was saying. It's not proper for a man to be in a lady's room without supervision. Which room? Garrett demanded. Second floor, end of the hall, Mrs. Fletcher replied, relief evident in her voice at Garrett's arrival. Please hurry. Garrett took the stairs at a run and found the door to Matilda's room ajar. Inside, Sheriff Wade was in the process of sliding a silver hairbrush into the drawer of the small dressing table. "Adding to your evidence, Sheriff?" Garrett asked from the doorway. Wade spun around, his face flushing with anger and surprise. "This is official business, James. Get out before I arrest you for obstruction." "I don't think you'll be arresting anyone else," Garrett replied calmly, though his hand hovered near his holstered pistol. Judge Parker arrived early. "He's at the jailhouse now, examining the contents of your safe." The color drained from Wade's face. For a moment, he seemed to consider his options, his eyes darting to the window and then back to Garrett. "Whatever you're thinking," Garrett warned, "it won't end well for you." Wade's shoulders sagged in defeat. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. Just a little extra money to supplement my salary. No one was supposed to get hurt." "Tell that to Miss Keating, who's sitting in your jail cell facing years in prison for a crime she didn't commit." Shame and defiance battled on Wade's features. "I never intended, save it for the judge," Garrett interrupted. "Now, we're going to walk downstairs together, and you're going to surrender your weapon to me." For a tense moment, Garrett thought Wade might resist, but the fight seemed to drain out of him. He unbuckled his gun belt and handed it to Garrett. "She really didn't steal anything, did she?" Garrett asked as they descended the stairs. Wade shook his head. "Mrs. Thornton misplaced her brooch at home. When she couldn't find it at the store either, I saw an opportunity. The seamstress was new in town, no family, easy target, and you've done this before." It wasn't a question, but Wade nodded anyway. "A few times, when opportunity presented itself." Mrs. Fletcher was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, her expression alternating between confusion and concern at the sight of the sheriff being escorted out by a ranch hand. "Mrs. Fletcher," Garrett said politely, "I believe Sheriff Wade may have left something in Miss Keating's room that doesn't belong there. Would you mind checking and bringing anything unusual to Judge Parker at the jailhouse?" Understanding dawned in the woman's eyes. "Of course, Mr. James. Right away." By the time Garrett and Wade reached the jailhouse, a small crowd had gathered. Word of the judge's early arrival and his interest in the sheriff's safe had spread through town with the speed of a prairie fire. Inside, Judge Parker was seated behind the sheriff's desk, the contents of the safe spread out before him. Deputy Charlie stood nearby, his young face a picture of shock and disillusionment. "Ah, Sheriff Wade," Parker said, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "How kind of you to join us. I was just admiring your collection of evidence that never seemed to make it into the court record." Wade remained silent, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Deputy," Parker continued, "please escort Sheriff Wade to the cell adjacent to Miss Keating's. It seems we'll be having a different trial than planned when court convenes tomorrow." As Charlie led Wade away, Judge Parker turned to Matilda, who was watching the proceedings with disbelief from her cell. "Miss Keating, it appears a grave injustice has been done to you. Deputy, please release this woman immediately." Charlie fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking slightly as he unlocked Matilda's cell. She stepped out cautiously, as if afraid the freedom might be snatched away again. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. Her eyes sought Garrett's. "And thank you, Mr. James, for believing in me when no one else would." Garrett nodded, suddenly aware of the crowd watching through the windows and door. "It was the right thing to do, Miss Keating." Judge Parker rose from the desk. "Mr. James, would you be so kind as to escort Miss Keating to her boarding house? I imagine she would like to rest and refresh herself after this ordeal. Deputy Charlie and I have matters to discuss regarding the future of law enforcement in Columbus." Outside, the crowd parted to let Garrett and Matilda pass. Some people looked embarrassed, others curious, and a few even offered quiet apologies for having believed the worst of her. They walked in silence until they reached the boarding house, where Mrs. Fletcher was waiting on the porch. The older woman rushed forward to embrace Matilda. "My dear, I am so terribly sorry for what you've endured. Your room is just as you left it well, except for a silver hairbrush that definitely wasn't yours. I've given it to Judge Parker as he requested." "Thank you, Mrs. Fletcher," Matilda said, her composure finally beginning to crack now that she was among friends. "I think I would like to rest for a while." Mrs. Fletcher nodded, patting Matilda's hand. "Of course, dear, and Mr. James is welcome to call on you later if you wish." Matilda turned to Garrett, a question in her eyes. "Would you call on me later, I mean, I'd like to thank you properly for all you've done." "I'll come by this evening," Garrett promised. "Get some rest, Miss Keating, you're safe now." As he turned to leave, Matilda caught his hand. "Matilda," she said softly, "please call me Matilda." A small smile tugged at the corner of Garrett's mouth. "Matilda," he repeated, her name feeling right on his tongue. "Until this evening." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity in Columbus. Judge Parker convened a special hearing where Sheriff Wade confessed to multiple counts of theft and evidence tampering. Several townspeople came forward with stories of missing items that had mysteriously disappeared after Wade had investigated, and the contents of the safe provided damning physical evidence. Wade was sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison, and Deputy Charlie, found to be ignorant of his superior's crimes, was appointed acting sheriff until a proper election could be held. For Matilda, the aftermath of her ordeal brought unexpected changes. Mrs. Everett, deeply ashamed of having doubted her, not only rehired Matilda but offered her a partnership in the dress shop. Mrs. Thornton, mortified by her role in the false accusation, commissioned an elaborate gown from Matilda as a gesture of apology and introduced her to several wealthy clients. But the most significant change was the regular presence of Garrett James in her life. What began as evening visits to check on her well-being evolved into walks through town, shared meals at the hotel restaurant, and long conversations on the boarding house porch that left Mrs. Fletcher sighing romantically behind her curtains. 2 weeks after her release from jail, Matilda and Garrett were enjoying a picnic by the creek that ran along the edge of town. The early summer sun dappled through the cottonwood trees, casting shifting patterns on the blanket where they sat. "I received a letter from Mr. Whittaker today," Garrett said, pouring Matilda a cup of coffee from a small tin pot. "He's offering me a promotion to foreman. The current foreman is moving to California and Whittaker wants me to take over." "Garrett, that's wonderful," Matilda exclaimed, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure for him. "You deserve it after all your hard work." "It comes with the use of the foreman's cabin," he continued, watching her face carefully. "It's not fancy, but it's sturdy. 2 rooms, a decent stove, space for a garden." Matilda's breath caught as she understood the direction of his words. "That sounds lovely." "It's a bit isolated," Garrett warned, his eyes never leaving hers. 10 miles from town is a fair distance." "Not so far," she replied softly. "Not if you have a good horse and good reason to make the journey." Garrett set down his coffee cup and took her hands in his. "Matilda, I've known you such a short time, but in that time, I've seen your courage, your integrity, your kindness. I find myself thinking about you when we're apart, and when we're together, I never want the time to end." Tears welled in Matilda's eyes, but they were tears of joy. "I feel the same," she whispered. "I'm not a man of wealth or fine education," Garrett continued, his voice growing husky with emotion. "All I can offer is a honest life, hard work, and a heart that would cherish you until my dying day." "That's more than I ever dared hope for," Matilda replied, squeezing his hands. Garrett reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the sunlight. It was a delicate silver ring with a small pearl set between two tiny blue stones. "I asked Mrs. Everett to help me choose it," he admitted with a smile. "She said you once admired a similar design in a catalog." Matilda laughed through her tears. "She's a terrible gossip, but in this case I'm glad of it. Matilda Keating, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, Garrett James, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her close for a kiss that held all the promise of their future together, a kiss that spoke of passion, commitment, and a love born in adversity, but destined to flourish in the wide open spaces of the New Mexico territory. Their wedding took place 3 weeks later in the small white church at the edge of town. The entire community turned out, partly from genuine affection for the couple and partly from curiosity about the remarkable story that had brought them together. Judge Parker, who had delayed his circuit to attend, performed the ceremony. Mrs. Everett wept openly into her handkerchief, while Mr. Whittaker stood proudly as Garrett's best man. Even Mrs. Thornton attended, resplendent in a new gown that Matilda had created especially for the occasion, her way of truly making amends. As they spoke their vows, Matilda reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought them to this moment. If she hadn't been falsely accused, if Garrett hadn't been curious enough to investigate, if he hadn't had the courage to challenge the sheriff's authority, they might never have found each other. After the ceremony, the entire town celebrated with a feast in the town square. There was dancing until sunset, with Garrett surprising everyone with his grace on the dance floor as he whirled his bride through a lively reel. As the celebration wound down, the couple prepared to depart for their new home. Garrett helped Matilda onto his horse, then mounted behind her, his arms encircling her waist as they set off toward the Whittaker Ranch and the foreman's cabin that awaited them. The ride gave them their first real moments alone as husband and wife. As the town faded into the distance behind them, Matilda leaned back against Garrett's chest, savoring the solid strength of him. "Happy," he murmured against her ear. "More than I can say," she replied, turning her face to meet his kiss. "When I rode into Columbus that day, I never imagined I'd be riding out with a wife," Garrett said, wonder in his voice. "Especially not one as beautiful and brave as you." Matilda laughed softly. "And I never imagined my false arrest would lead to true love." "Fate works in mysterious ways," Garrett agreed, guiding the horse around a bend in the trail. As they crested a small hill, the Whittaker Ranch came into view in the distance, its buildings outlined against the setting sun. Closer, just visible through a stand of cottonwoods, was a small cabin with smoke rising from its chimney. "Mr. Whittaker sent some of the hands ahead to prepare the cabin for us," Garrett explained. "Said a new bride shouldn't have to walk into a cold house on her wedding night." Tears pricked Matilda's eyes at the thoughtfulness. That was kind of him. When they reached the cabin, Garrett dismounted first, then reached up to lift Matilda down. But instead of setting her on her feet, he swept her into his arms. "Mrs. James," he said, his voice husky, "welcome home." He carried her across the threshold into the cabin where a fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the simple but comfortable furnishings. Someone had placed wildflowers in a jar on the table and laid out a cold supper with a bottle of wine. But neither Matilda nor Garrett paid much attention to these details, as they came together in an embrace that sealed their union in the most intimate way, discovering in each other's arms the passion that had been building between them since that first meeting in the jail. Later, as they lay tangled in the sheets of their marriage bed, Matilda traced the line of Garrett's jaw with her finger. "I still can't believe how quickly everything has changed." 2 months ago, I was just a seamstress trying to build a new life. Now I'm a wife, a partner in a dress shop, and starting a whole new adventure. Do you regret any of it? Garrett asked, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. Not a moment, she assured him. Every step, even the painful ones, led me to you. The weeks and months that followed settled into a rhythm that suited them both. Garrett rode to the ranch each day to oversee the operations, occasionally staying overnight when cattle drives or emergencies required it. Matilda divided her time between their home, where she tended a thriving vegetable garden and made their cabin into a true home, and the dress shop in town, where her partnership with Mrs. Everett flourished. 3 days a week, Garrett would drive Matilda to town in their small wagon, leaving her at the shop while he conducted ranch business, and then they would return home together in the evening, sharing the events of their day. As winter approached, bringing with it the first hint of snow on the distant mountains, Matilda made an announcement that filled Garrett with joy. She was expecting their first child, due in the late spring. Mr. Whitaker, upon hearing the news, insisted that Garrett build an addition to the cabin. "Can't have my foreman's family cramped," he declared, sending several ranch hands to help with the construction. By the time the snows melted and the wildflowers began to carpet the prairie, the cabin had a new room built onto its eastern side, with windows positioned to catch the morning sun, the perfect nursery for the child that would soon join their family. On a warm May evening, with Mrs. Everett and the ranch doctor in attendance, Matilda gave birth to a healthy son whom they named Thomas William James, honoring both Garrett's father and Judge Parker, who had played such a pivotal role in bringing them together. The judge himself rode out to the ranch to see the baby when he next passed through Columbus, bringing with him news that the territorial governor had finally appointed a new sheriff, a former Army officer with an impeccable reputation for honesty. And what of Wade? Matilda asked as she poured coffee for their distinguished visitor, baby Thomas sleeping peacefully in a cradle that Garrett had crafted by hand. "Still serving his sentence," Parker replied, "though I hear he's become something of a model prisoner. Working in the prison library, teaching some of the other inmates to read." Garrett nodded thoughtfully. "People can change, I suppose, if they're given the chance to make amends." "Indeed they can," Parker agreed, his gaze moving between Garrett and Matilda with obvious approval. Just as adversity can forge the strongest bonds between people who might otherwise never have connected. That night, after the judge had departed and Thomas had been fed and settled back to sleep, Garrett and Matilda sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the stars emerge in the vast New Mexico sky. "I was thinking," Matilda said, her head resting on Garrett's shoulder, "about opening a second shop in Silver City. Mrs. Everett says there's demand for fine dressmaking there, and with the railroad coming through, it could be a good opportunity." Garrett considered this, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Would you want to move there?" "No," she replied quickly. "This is our home. But perhaps I could train someone to manage the new shop, travel there occasionally to oversee things." "An ambitious plan," Garrett said with pride in his voice, "but if anyone can make it work, you can." Matilda smiled up at him. "We make a good team, don't we, the cowboy and the seamstress?" "The best," Garrett agreed, lowering his head to kiss her. "Who would have thought that a stolen brooch would lead to all this happiness?" "Not stolen," Matilda corrected with a teasing smile. "Merely misplaced in the sheriff's safe." Garrett laughed, the sound carrying across the peaceful ranch land that had become their domain. "A fortunate misplacement, then, for both of us." As the years passed, their family grew. Thomas was joined by a sister, Eleanor, 2 years later, and then by another brother, James, the following year. Their cabin expanded accordingly, with Garrett adding rooms as needed, until it resembled less a foreman's cabin and more a proper ranch house. When Mr. Whitaker decided to retire to California, he offered Garrett the opportunity to buy the ranch at a price that, while still requiring years of payments, was fair and attainable. With Matilda's dress shop business now expanded to 3 locations across the territory, they were able to make the down payment and become landowners in their own right. Columbus grew as well, transformed by the railroad and the increasing settlement of the territory. The small town where Matilda had once been falsely imprisoned became a thriving community, with the James family respected as founding members of its emerging society. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Garrett surprised Matilda with a trip to Santa Fe, leaving their children in the capable care of Mrs. Everett, who had become like a grandmother to them. In the territorial capital, they attended the theater, dined in fine restaurants, and for 5 days remembered what it was like to be simply husband and wife rather than ranchers, business owners, and parents. On their last night in Santa Fe, as they prepared for bed in their hotel room, Garrett presented Matilda with a small box. "Another anniversary gift?" she asked, touched by his thoughtfulness. The trip itself was more than enough. "Open it," he urged, watching her face eagerly. Inside was a silver brooch with a turquoise stone not identical to Mrs. Thornton's, which had been returned to its rightful owner long ago, but similar enough to evoke the memory. "Garrett," Matilda breathed, running her finger over the cool metal. "It's beautiful." "I had it made specially," he explained, "to remind us of where we began, how finding the truth brought us together." Matilda pinned the brooch to her nightdress, then wound her arms around her husband's neck. "As if I could ever forget. You saved me in more ways than one, Garrett James." "And you saved me right back," he replied, drawing her close. "From a life of solitude, from never knowing what it meant to love so completely." Their kiss deepened, passion undiminished by the decade they'd spent together. As they fell into the hotel bed, their bodies remembered the dance they'd perfected over years of marriage, moving together with the familiarity of long-time lovers, yet still discovering new ways to bring each other pleasure. Afterward, as they lay content in each other's arms, Matilda reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The false accusation that could have ruined her life had instead given her everything she'd ever wanted: a loving husband, beautiful children, a successful business, a place in the community. "What are you thinking about?" Garrett asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "About destiny," Matilda replied. "Do you believe some things are meant to be, that no matter what path we might have taken, we would have found each other somehow?" Garrett considered this, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "I don't know about destiny," he said finally. "But I do believe that good hearts recognize each other. That truth finds a way to surface given time, and that love once found can weather any storm." Matilda smiled, settling more comfortably against him. "That's good enough for me." When they returned to their ranch, the children ran to greet them, full of stories about their adventures with Mrs. Everett. The older woman followed more slowly, her face creased with affectionate amusement. "They were angels," she reported, though the twinkle in her eye suggested otherwise. "Though Thomas nearly convinced Alina that rattlesnakes make good pets." Garrett laughed, swinging his eldest son up onto his shoulders. "Is that so, young man? We'll have to have a talk about that." As the family moved toward the house, now a sprawling ranch home that bore little resemblance to the original foreman's cabin, Matilda paused to take in the scene. Her children's laughter, her husband's steady presence, the land that had become their legacy stretching out toward the horizon. From false accusations had come truth. From injustice, justice. From chance meetings, a love that would endure as long as the New Mexico sky stretched overhead, vast and endless and full of promise. And in that moment, Matilda Keating James knew with absolute certainty that every step of her journey, even the darkest ones, had led her exactly where she was meant to be, home, in the heart of the man who had believed in her when no one else would, surrounded by the family they had built together in the wild territory that had become their own.